spears, harpoons, grains, oars, sails, spars, folding cage, everything with which a strictly scientific expedition is usually burdened. Evelyn was washing her face in the crystal waters of a branch that flowed into the lagoon from under the live oaks. She looked very pretty doing it, like a naiad or dryad scrubbing away at her forest toilet. It was, in fact, such a pretty spectacle that I was going over to sit beside her while she did it, but Kemper started just what I was going to do, and I turned away. Some men invariably do the wrong thing, but a handsome man doesn't last long with a pretty girl. I was thinking of this as I stood contemplating an alligator slide, which Grew came back saying that the shore on which we had landed was the termination of a shell mound, and that it was the only dry place he had found. So I bade him pitch our tents a few feet back from the shore, and stood watching him while he did so, one eye reverting occasionally to Evelyn Gray and Kemper. They were both seated cross-legged beside the branch, and they seemed to be talking a great deal and rather earnestly. I couldn't quite understand what they found to talk about so earnestly and volubly all of a sudden, inasmuch as they had heretofore exchanged very few observations during a most brief and formal acquaintance, dating only from sundown the day before. Grew set up our 3 tents, carried the luggage inland, and then hung about for a while until the last shadow of a vulture swept across the trees. I never saw such an indescribable expression on a human face as I saw on Grew's as he looked up at the huge, unclean bird. His vitreous eyes fairly glittered, the corners of his mouth quivered and grew wet, and to my astonishment he seemed to emit a low, mewing noise. "What the devil are you doing?" I said impulsively, and in my amazement and disgust. He looked at me, his eyes still glittering, the corners of his mouth still wet, but the curious sounds had ceased. "What?" he asked. "Nothing. I thought you spoke." I didn't know what else to say. He made no reply. Once, when I had partly turned my head, I was aware that he was warily turning his to look at the vulture, which had alighted heavily on the ground near the entrails and heads of the mullet, where he had cast them on the dead leaves. I walked over to where Evelyn Gray and Kemper sat so busily conversing, and their volubility ceased as they glanced up and saw me approaching, which phenomenon both perplexed and displeased me. I said, "This is the Black Bayou Forest, and we have the most serious business of our lives before us. Suppose you and I start out, Kemper, and see if there are any traces of what we are after in the neighborhood of our camp." "Do you think it's safe to leave Miss Gray alone in camp?" he asked gravely. I hadn't thought of that. "No, of course not," I said. "Grew can stay." "I don't need anybody," she said quickly. "Anyway, I'm rather afraid of Grew." "Afraid of Grew?" I repeated. "Not exactly afraid, but he's unpleasant." "I'll remain with Miss Gray," said Kemper politely. "Oh," she exclaimed, "I couldn't ask that. It is true that I feel a little tired and nervous, but I can go with you and Mr. Smith and Grew." I surveyed Kemper in cold perplexity. As chief of the expedition, I couldn't very well offer to remain with Evelyn Gray, but I didn't propose that Kemper should either. "Take Grew," he suggested, "and look about the woods for a while. Perhaps after dinner Miss Gray may feel sufficiently rested to join us." "I am sure," she said, "that a few hours' rest in camp will set me on my feet. All I need is rest. I didn't sleep very soundly last night." I felt myself growing red, and I looked away from them both. "Oh," said Kemper in apparent surprise, "I thought you had slept soundly all night long." "Nobody," said I, "could have slept very pleasantly during that musical performance of yours." "Were you singing?" she asked innocently of Kemper. "He was singing when he wasn't firing off his pistol," I remarked. "No wonder you couldn't sleep with any satisfaction to yourself." Gru had disappeared into the forest. I stood watching for him to come out again. After a few minutes I heard a furious but distant noise of flapping. The others also heard it, and we listened in silence, wondering what it was. "It's Gru killing something," faltered Evelyn Gray, turning a trifle pale. "Confound it!" I exclaimed. "I'm going to stop that right now." Kemper rose and followed me as I started for the woods, but as we passed the beached boats, Gru appeared from among the trees. "Where have you been?" I demanded. "In the woods." "Doing what?" "Nothing." There was a bit of down here and there clinging to his cotton shirt and trousers, and one had caught and stuck at the corner of his mouth. "See here, Gru," I said, "I don't want you to kill any birds except for camp purposes. Why do you try to catch and kill birds?" "I don't." I stared at the man, and he stared back at me out of his glassy eyes. "You mean to say that you don't, somehow or other, manage to catch and kill birds?" "No, I don't." There was nothing further for me to say unless I gave him the lie. I didn't care to do that, needing his services. Evelyn Gray had come up to join us. There was a brief silence. We all stood looking at Gru, and he looked back at us out of his pale, washed-out, and unblinking eyes. "Gru," I said, "I haven't yet explained to you the object of this expedition to Black Bayou. Now I'll tell you what I want. But first, let me ask you a question or two. You know the Black Bayou Forest, don't you?" "Yes." "Did you ever see anything unusual in these forests?" "No." "Are you sure?" The man stared at us, one after another. Then he said, "What are you looking for in Black Bayou?" "Something very curious, very strange, very unusual. So strange and unusual, in fact, that the great Zoological Society of the Bronx in New York has sent me down here at the head of this expedition to search the forests of Black Bayou." "For what?" he demanded in a dull, accentless voice. "For a totally new species of human being, Gru. I wish to catch one and take it back to New York in that folding cage." His green eyes had grown narrow, as though sun-dazzled. Kemper had stepped behind us into the woods, and was now busy setting up the folding cage. Gru remained motionless. "I am going to offer you," I said, "the sum of $1,000 in gold if you can guide us to a spot where we may see this hitherto unknown species, a creature which is apparently a man, but which has, in the back of his head, a third eye." I paused in amazement. Gru's cheeks had suddenly puffed out and were quivering, and from the corners of his slitted mouth he was emitting a whimpering sound like the noise made by a low circling pigeon. "Gru," I cried, "what's the matter with you?" "What is he doing?" screamed Gru, quivering from head to foot, but not turning around. "Who?" I cried. "The man behind me." "Professor Kemper, he's setting up the folding cage." With a screech that raised my hair, Gru whipped out his murderous knife and hurled himself backward at Kemper. But the latter shrank aside behind the partly erected cage, and Gru whirled around, snarling, hacking, and even biting at the wood frame and steel bars. And then occurred a thing so horrid that it sickened me to the pit of my stomach. For the man's sagging straw hat had fallen off, and there, in the back of his head, through the coarse, black, ratty hair, I saw a glassy eye glaring at me. "Kemper!" I shouted. "He's got a third eye! He's one of them! Knock him flat with your rifle stock!" And I seized a shotgun from the top of the baggage bundle on the ground beside me and leaped at Gru, aiming a terrific blow at him. But the glassy eye in the back of his head was watching me between the clotted strands of hair, and he dodged both Kemper